Well, we've seen a major escalation in the war in Ukraine this week. Russia launching its largest multi-city barrage since the opening days of the war. All in retaliation, of course, for Ukraine's alleged involvement in the truck bombing on the Russian Crimea Bridge. Of course, after 233 days of this war, what was meant to be a snap invasion and takeover of the country has seen major setbacks for the once mighty Russian military and a major embarrassment for Vladimir Putin. And he knows it, relying on a constant threat of nuclear retaliation, which some experts and world leaders have labelled a bluff. But that was before this week's other concerning development. Russian troops are now moving into Belarus after Putin's puppet and fellow dictator Alexander Lukashenko announced the nation's militaries would join forces. Could this be Putin laying the groundwork for a concerning new stage in the war, and will that involve nuclear weapons? To analyse this for us tonight, we're joined now by Flinders University's International Relations lecturer, Dr Jessica Genauer. Jess, thank you very much for your time. After the bombing on the Kerch Bridge, are we closer or further away, do you think, from Putin resorting to nuclear weapons?
Yeah, thanks for the question. So, unfortunately, I would have to say that we are a little closer to the possibility of Putin using a nuclear weapon, whilst it's not something that anyone wants to contemplate. But I would say not so much because of the bombing of the Kerch Bridge itself, but rather because of the way in which Putin reacted to that attack. So following that bombing, we saw multiple missiles, dozens of missiles dropping all over Ukraine into the heart of cities, striking civilian targets. And the fact that, Putin showed that he's willing to respond to attacks that could, be seen to be humiliating for Russia, also responding to sort of the military failures for Russia in recent weeks and months, he's willing to respond to that by striking, clearly at civilian targets and into the heart of cities. Also, I think further raises that spectre of would he be willing to sort of go that extra step and use not only conventional weapons, but also potentially a nuclear weapon. Now, having said that, whilst I think that threat has been maybe increased, I do think it's still quite far away just because Putin understands that there would be a severe response from Ukraine's Western partners if he were to actually use, some kind of nuclear weapon.
OK, what about his lack of options right now? He's got amateur conscripts being dragged into training. And not enough of them because most of the smart blokes have left the country in a hurry. Could that realisation trigger a nuclear attack because his options are narrowing?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I think, it's a good question. I mean, on the one hand, I don't think that Putin actually expected that this mobilisation, or as he announced it, a partial military mobilisation would solve Russia's problems on the battlefield. But he did that in order to show the Russian domestic population that he was doing something. And in particular, domestic populations who are actually in support of this war, or special military operation, as it's called within Russia. So I think it's not so much necessarily the mobilisation itself, but the fact that the chaotic way in which it's been implemented has actually prompted criticisms domestically from within Russia. And that, I think, is very concerning for Putin because these are people not who've been opposed to the war since the beginning, who he probably, doesn't care about their opinion that much. These are people who actually support Putin, who have been supporting the special military operation and now are saying, what's going on? Why is this mobilisation so chaotic? Why is Russia suffering all of these failures on the battlefront? And I think it's that could potentially lead Putin to something like the use of a nuclear weapon in order to show those who are actually in support of Russia's war that he is doing something and that Russia still does have some kind of power left, even though, as I mentioned earlier, I think that the deterrence there is quite strong, that Putin understands that there would be quite a severe response if that were to happen.
You host a podcast called War in Ukraine, Update from Kiev, and you delved into this Belarus involvement in today's episode. Lukashenko has always supported Putin, but has stopped short of going into combat with him and mixing their troops. This is about to change, and what does it say to you?
Yeah, so this is quite an interesting development. So we've had this declaration from Belarus and Russia that they're going to now form a joint military group. Now, actually, I don't see this. I mean, this is still quite far from Belarus's direct entry into the war in Ukraine. And whilst this is a further step from what Belarus has been doing until now, it's really quite an incremental step. I mean, already Belarus, Lukashenko, the president of Belarus, has thrown himself completely behind Putin. He's clearly declared his support of Putin's war in Ukraine, or special military operation, as it's called, in Russia. And, you know, he's allowed Russia to use Belarusian territory for military activities. So this is one more kind of small incremental step of Lukashenko showing Putin, I'm with you, I support you, I'm behind you. But at the same time, Lukashenko understands that if Belarus was to actually engage directly and fully in Russia's war in Ukraine, that would be incredibly unpopular with the Belarusian people. So the Belarusian people, broadly speaking, do not support the war, do not want Belarus to enter into that war, and that includes those in the military. So, you know, the military is drawn from the general population, and those in the military don't want to be going and dying in Ukraine and fighting in Ukraine for what they essentially see to be Russia's war. So Lukashenko does understand that if Belarus was to enter more directly into the war, he would actually be posing a very severe risk to his own grip on power domestically within Belarus. So right. I don't see him doing that, you know, that full entry of Belarus into the conflict.
All right. Great analysis. Dr Jessica Genauer, thank you very much for your time.